You are listening to the Bat Flip Podcast, a baseball podcast from Belly Up Sports and the Belly Up Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Damian and Matt.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Bat Flip Podcast. My name is Damian here with my co-host, Matt, coming to you on August 3rd of 2021. This is going to be our trade deadline episode. We had a massive trade deadline this year. All in all, looking at in the month of July, it was 62 trades happened. We're going to mention or at least talk about at least 30 of them today. But before we jump into all that, how you doing, Matt?
Doing pretty good. Just been hanging out. That trade deadline was absolutely nuts last week. Man, everything's going good. I'm going on vacation this weekend, so that'll be fun, and looking forward to it. And I'm just excited to get into a probably long show. Talk about some of these trades that happened, because this was the craziest trade deadline I think in my memory. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at just the number of trades alone through, the past. I mean, this is from like 1986, and this blows it out of the water by like 20 something trades. So just in the month of July alone. So definitely, like you said, there's some moves that we didn't expect to happen. There's some massive moves that we probably thought were coming, but even blew our minds even more. So we're just going to take this kind of in chronological order of how it happened. And we'll start on July 28th. Is kind of when we had started from. And the Seattle Mariners, after we talked about them last week, trading away their closer and Kendall Graveman and the whole clubhouse being upset, they went and made a move that night and got Tyler Anderson from the Pittsburgh Pirates.
yeah, so this is an interesting deal. Tyler Anderson actually was originally rumored to have been traded to the Phillies, and he all of a sudden it turned out he didn't get traded to the Phillies. I think there might have been a problem with a physical of one of the players that were in return.
Yeah.
Either way, he ended up getting moved to the Mariners. Tyler Anderson got really good control this year, has improved on that. He's a back end of the rotation starter. His metrics and his results have shown about a low to mid fours ERA. He's not horrible, but he's a pretty reliable arm. He's thrown 108 innings already this year, so he's been out there a lot. He's a guy who they can count on to not completely get shelled every night. At the back end of the rotation, and he got moved for a couple of prospects who are really non-prospects. Carter Benz is a catching prospect. He's got some nice power. That's about it. Not great defensively. And then the pitcher in return, Joaquin Tejada, got some good breaking stuff and possibly some command. He's really young, but neither one of them are in the top 40 for their new team, for the Pittsburgh Pirates, who do have a deep system. But either way, so.
Yeah, it's a really interesting move, and like you said, he's a solid rotation arm that's just going to be able to eat some innings and keep them in ball games at least. So,
No doubt.
But the next one we had was we're going to kind of group two together, and that was the Cincinnati Reds kind of did a little bullpen remake. They traded for right-hander Luis Cessa and left-hander Justin Wilson from the New York Yankees, and then they made a trade for right-hander Michael Givens from the Colorado Rockies.
Yeah, this was an interesting move here. You look at Luis Cessa. He's a guy who's been good this year. His stats say, a 2.75 ERA. That might be a little bit low for him, but he still had a pretty good year. Michael Gibbons is a guy who, originally with the Orioles, he's been traded a couple times now. Hadn't been great. His metrics say he's been pretty poor. His ERA says otherwise. That's been really good. He's a guy who's been a pretty solid middle relief piece for his career, and definitely can help the Reds. And then, you look at this, you look at Justin Wilson, a guy who has always had command problems, but at times can turn it on for a little while. So there are some relievers that'll help the Reds. They needed to deepen their bullpen a little bit. They got a couple good arms back there, but this will definitely help their bullpen get a little bit deeper. So.
Yeah, and they're trying to make a run in that NL Central with being second behind the Milwaukee Brewers right now.
Yes.
So solid for them to get some, a good lefty at times. Justin Wilson, I mean, I think he's really struggled this year, but a fireballing lefty, I mean, you never know when those guys can just start clicking it back on. And then Givens and Cessa have been two solid relievers, so it's not overall bad for the Reds to try and just improve their club a little bit right there with the bullpen. So.
Yep, for sure.
So the next move we had was the Houston Astros acquired Yimi Garcia from the Miami Marlins for right-hander Austin Pruitt and outfielder Brian De La Cruz.
Yeah, so this is a pretty good deal. The Astros are another team that wanted to help their bullpen out some. Their starting rotation's been really good this year. Their lineup is pretty nasty, so just a couple reinforcements in their bullpen at this deadline. You look at Yimi Garcia as a guy who has been good. He's another guy who's been good, but maybe not like a lead or anything. Um, a 3.62 ERA on the year. His metrics are not that good. They're the mid to low fours, which for relievers not great. Last year he was extremely good in his first year in Miami, although it was a real small sample size with the COVID shortened season. But former Dodger who has had a little bit of an up and down time with them. He's a guy who I think will help. It'll help deepen their bullpen in Houston as well. He's not going to close or be really relied upon in real tight games or anything, but it'll help him out. The return, Austin Pruitt's already been DFA'd, and the outfielder prospect, he's going to be the number 28 prospect now for the Marlins, and Brian De La Cruz. I think he got called up actually already. He's kind of decent all around, probably a bench outfielder type in the future. So.
Yeah, and like you said, Garcia had closed a little bit for the Marlins. He's been a real streaky reliever. At least I remember that from the time when he was with the Dodgers. He'll go on stretches where he looks unhittable, and then he'll go on stretches where it seems like every pitch he throws is a home run or something. So if the Astros can use him in those spots where they understand that he's on that day and not trying to make him close and be more of a 6th to 7th inning guy, it could be a solid bullpen arm for them. But
No doubt.
let's move over to, I think this was the first trade that kind of shocked me, and was our group chat kind of lit up on this one. But that was the Starling Marte being acquired by the Oakland A's for left-handed pitcher Jesus Luzardo.
Yeah, so this is probably the first really interesting trade. Jesus Luzardo is a guy who, in 2020, was rated the number 5 overall prospect based on Fangraphs rankings, and number 1 in the A's system, of course, being top 5. Throws really hard, averaged 96 on his fastball this year in the big leagues. But ever since he got up to the big leagues, really, it has been a huge struggle for him with the home run ball, uh, leaving a lot of pitches over the plate. And after he really started struggling with that, he started struggling with walks as well this year. He's been a guy, maybe his confidence is shot a little bit. I was watching some stuff the other day with a guy who him being a guy who doesn't really have that much extension off the mound, so maybe guys pick him up a little bit better than others. But I mean, the stuff is absolutely filthy, and you would hope, although he also has a little bit of a tough injury history, you would think that there's still a lot of talent there, and he still has a chance to really click at some point. So. You look at Starling Marte as a rental outfielder who's a really solid all around outfielder. Can make all the plays defensively, hits the ball well. He's really a guy that I think fits in real well for the A's. Good plate discipline this year, at least. And really in his career, his strikeout rate's always been low, but this year he's really kicked up his walk rate a lot. Um, and he's a guy who I think is a really solid player. It's going to help the A's a lot. So.
Yeah, and like you said, he's having a career year this year. So for the Oakland A's, maybe they catch fire with him. And it was really head scratching them giving up Jesus Luzardo. But the A's are one of those teams that are always trying to do. They have famous for having the Moneyball movie, but they're always trying to make those moves kind of under the radar. And I mean, if they're willing to give up on a guy like Jesus Luzardo, maybe that's saying something. But maybe Miami knows something that other people don't, and that they could find something to click with Jesus Luzardo. I think it was a really good you know, a really good return for Rental and Starling Marte for the Miami Marlins.
Yeah, and regardless of whether or not Jesus Luzardo makes it big time, this is absolutely 100% worth it for the Marlins to try. I mean, Starling Marte was leaving um, in free agency after this year, anyways, so
The
this
potential
was a
that they have.
no-brainer to try to fix Jesus Luzardo with
Yeah,
his natural talent. So.
absolutely. Well, the next trade we had was one that we had at least a player that we had speculated on being traded. We thought he was traded actually multiple times before, and it happened, actually at the deadline. But that's infielder Eduardo Escobar being acquired by the Milwaukee Brewers for infielder and outfielder Cooper Hummel and infielder Alberto Cyprian.
Yeah, so Eduardo Escobar is a good player. He's a guy who at the plate is going to hit pretty well. You know, he doesn't strike out a ton, but he always hits. You know, has a pretty low batting average on balls in play. Career mark at 289. You know, he's just a little bit streaky at the plate. Has some power. He's hit 24 home runs this year already, which is a pretty high number. Doesn't walk a ton, but you know, it's not like he's allergic to walks like Javier Baez or somebody. But I mean, he's been good this year. He was good for Arizona. You know, he's a guy who I think is you know, I think he definitely is a guy who can help the Brewers and you know, they need some hitters and so they've really struggled hitting the ball um, you know, at times this year, and their lineup doesn't have too many guys that'll put fear into you. And the return, Cooper Hummel's kind of a utility type player. You know, he's played catcher a little bit, played outfield some. Not a great fielder. Really, not too much. You know, with him, he's got pretty good numbers at times in the minor leagues. You know, with Milwaukee, he had a 153 WRC plus this year in their minor league in their AAA system. So definitely a guy to maybe keep an eye on, being a late bloomer type. He's 26 years old, and so interesting there. The other guy in this return, Alberto Cyprian. I mean, he's a guy who he's in the Dominican Summer League right now, and he's got pretty good numbers there. So it's hard to say what he'll end up turning into. He's 18 years old, so anytime you can get a young guy like that, you never know what might happen with him. So
Yeah, Eduardo Escobar is a really interesting fit for the Brewers because he can play pretty much everywhere on that infield. And the Brewers kind of lack everywhere on that infield. I mean, they lack first baseman at times when Keston Hiura is not really playing that well. Or I think they were the ones that got Rowdy Tellez as well. So maybe if he's
yeah,
not up, second base, if Colton Wong, I mean, he's been pretty solid when he's played there, but I think he's
Ad-
also dealt with some injuries this year.
Adamas has been really good for them at short this
Yeah,
year. After the trade, so I mean, I think it'll probably be mostly third base, but that versatility really does help his value because when you do want to give one of these other guys a day off, like say you're facing a tough lefty, you don't necessarily want Colt Wong facing.
right.
You might be able to throw Eduardo Escobar out there, or one of those things like you said with Rowdy Tellez. You face a tough lefty, you might want to put Eduardo Escobar at first base to try to against a guy like that. So definitely a good move for the Brewers, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and jump over to this is going to be on the 29th now. The first trade of that day was the White Sox acquiring second baseman Cesar Hernandez from the Indians/Guardians, however you want to call him now, for left-handed pitcher Connor
Pilkington, yeah,
Pilkington. There you go.
yeah. So this is an interesting deal. I'm shocked at the fact that Cesar Hernandez has hit 18 home runs this year. Um, in fact, that is already his career high in home runs for a season. So very surprising there. He's also hit for a career low average, which is directly tied to a very low batting average on balls in play compared to his typical number there. Actually never had a season below 313 on balls in play until this year, and he's at 263. So you would expect that number to go up a pretty good bit. And his career average is 331. So this is a move that could pay dividends if that power surge is real and his BABIP continues to come back up some. He could really be a solid piece there for the Chicago White Sox, and he's a guy who walks a lot too. You could honestly put him in near the top of the order. He's gonna get on base a lot and hit for a pretty nice, maybe not a ton of power, but a pretty good, pretty good leadoff type hitter here. Get on base a ton, and he also plays good defense at second base. So he's been a positive this year, last year, year before last. He's been really good in his career, and I think this was a pretty good pickup for the White Sox here.
Yeah.
The return
Okay.
being, not too much. Connor Pilkington's kind of an organizational lefty that was in the White Sox system. So
Yeah, Pilkington probably is gonna. I mean, he probably projects to be a bullpen arm, if anything. um, a lefty reliever. Hernandez, like you said, it was interesting. I didn't realize until probably a week before the deadline when I was kind of like looking around that he had hit that many homers. Um, it kind of seems like he went more for a fly ball approach. I haven't actually looked for his fly ball to ground ball rate, but it seems like he probably went for more of a fly ball approach. The interesting thing that I did think with Hernandez is that the past couple years he has 0 stolen bases. This is a guy that when he was in Philly, I mean, he had 19, 17, 15, 19, and then 9 in 2019. So it's just interesting that he pretty much just stopped running. But the White Sox team is usually an aggressive team, so it will be interesting that if they do put him towards the top of that order, if he gets back to running some. But like you said, definitely an interesting move. They were a team that had already lost Nick Madrigal this year to an injury at second base and kind of had a hole, and they were interested in Trevor Story and a whole bunch of other shortstops. I mean, they were interested supposedly in Javi Baez at some point. So for them to pick up Cesar Hernandez, true second baseman, it's a pretty solid move, and like you said, for not too much of a return, really.
Yeah, and you were totally right about the fly ball thing. I didn't even look at that. His fly ball rate is a career high, and it's 9% higher than it was last year. So that's definitely a good call on that because I think that probably has something to do with the low batting average on balls in play as well.
Yeah, probably. So let's go to our next move we had, and that was the Toronto Blue Jays acquiring left-handed relief pitcher Brad Hand from the Washington Nationals for catcher Riley Adams.
Yeah, so you look at the Blue Jays here, making a move, trying to strengthen their bullpen, which has really been ravaged by injury this year. Especially their big signing in the offseason for their bullpen was Kirby Yates, and he immediately got injured needing Tommy John surgery. But Brad Hand's a guy who's been a good pitcher for a long time, but this year has been a struggle for him. His his ERA is still okay at a 383, but his other stats, his peripherals have been rough. His walks are way up, his strikeouts are way down. He is getting more grounders than he has in a while, but giving up home runs this year more than he ever has. It's really been a bit of a struggle for him so far, in this season. And the talent's probably still there to turn it around some, but he's also a veteran. Who's up over 30 now, so this drop off might kind of be real, for a reliever who, relievers are always pretty volatile. So
Yeah, and he has a lot of, even for like you said, I think he's only 31. Yeah, he's only
yeah,
31, but he still has a lot of innings on his arm for even a 31-year-old, even as a reliever. You look at his career innings. I mean, he's over 650 for a relief pitcher. That's quite a bit. Um, like you said, he's still pretty solid. I think this is just one of those kind of down years, and that he'll be able to bounce back at some point. Um, like you said, lowest K percentage since he's really turned to a full time reliever. Highest walk rate since he's really turned into a full time reliever. I mean, I just think that this is probably one of those down years. Like you said, relievers are so volatile. Um, it's a solid move for the Blue Jays because they need some pitching help all around. A good lefty that maybe you can, like I said, these numbers are higher than pretty much every one of his other career numbers. So maybe you can help him find something that unlocks, the old Brad Hand and kind of turn him into that late inning reliever again. But really
yeah,
interesting for the Blue Jays. And Riley Adams, he isn't much of a thing to really give away. He's a top 20 prospect in the national system now. Only per fan grabs, only a future value of 40. Um, I think they called him. No, they haven't called him up. Toronto had him up earlier this year and 30 at bats, which is small sample size. He's only batted 107 with a 167 on base. So
yeah. He's a high strikeout guy with some decent raw power, but he really isn't much else than that at this stage. So
absolutely. Well, let's jump over to our. I would say at this point when this deal happened, it was the biggest deal that we had go down, and that is the Yankees acquiring Joey Gallo and left-handed reliever Jolie Rodriguez from the Texas Rangers for Ezekiel Duran, Josh Smith, Trevor Hauver, and Glenn Otto.
yeah, this is an interesting deal here. Joey Gallo is one of the more polarizing players in baseball. He's also one of the more streaky players in baseball who's dealt with injuries at times. He's a guy who, strikeouts are just. I mean, he's if he plays long enough, he's going to shatter the career strikeout record. I mean, just shatter it into smithereens. I mean, he has struck out over 30% every year in the big leagues. This year at 32%, and his career batting average is 210. But he hits home runs and he hits them like crazy when he's healthy. And he's a guy who, he's hit 25 home runs already this year. He's having the best year of his career at the plate, other than a shortened 2019 season, which ended early due to injury. Um, but I think he's a guy who, you know, he is running a career low strikeout rate, although the career low strikeout rate is still 32%. But he's an interesting player. He's turned into a solid defender in the outfield, which is a good thing for the now the Yankees. But he's a guy who, he is what he is. If you like him for what he is, he's a guy who's going to hit massive home runs. He does get on base at a pretty good clip, even with the strikeouts, because he walks a lot. So
Yeah, he's one of those true three outcome hitters.
yes, he's the biggest
Epitome.
definition of a true outcome hitter. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just what he is. But there's going to be times where he gets booed out of the stadium in the Bronx because of the strikeouts. I remember when Giancarlo Stanton had his first year there, and he had a 5 strikeout game, and I mean they just booed him out of the stadium.
Mhm.
That's going to happen at some point, but they're also going to love him at some point because he's going to hit 3 home runs in the game. So
Yeah, especially that
it'll be
short
interesting to
porch.
see. Yeah, if you can get him on a hot streak at the right time, you can really he can really be something there. But I mean, I've never been a gigantic fan because of the approach and stuff. Um, it's something that's always worried me about him being on my team, but at the same time, there there's obvious talent there, and the power is real, and his numbers. When you look at more of the advanced numbers, his numbers, he's really valuable to a team. So that's a big deal getting him for the Yankees, who have struggled in the outfield. And you also get a pretty good little left-handed pitcher in Yoli Rodriguez, who's pretty young, and he's had a couple of years where he looked pretty good on the mound as a reliever. So um, fairly interesting there. They also got the Rangers paid down some of the rest of this year's deal for him because of the Yankees wanting to stay below the luxury tax threshold. So
Yeah, and like you said, Gallo is probably one of those players that um, is he's one of the most favorite one or not favorite. How to say that? He's probably one of the most fun ones to watch when he's not on your team. But if he's on your team, you're gonna absolutely hate it most of the time. Um, but if you're looking at the return for what they got, Ezekiel Duran, he's one of those guys that has big power but a questionable hit tool. He becomes the Rangers' third overall prospect for the
does
team.
that, does that sound familiar? Big power
Yeah,
with
yeah,
a questionable hit tool.
right. He's overall per Fangraphs, he's ranked 120th overall in baseball. 50 future value. Doesn't really have major speed. So he's kind of a Joey Gallo 2.0 if they can harness it. But he plays second base, so not really an outfield. And he's not quite as big. He's only 5'11". The other interesting one that I found was Josh Smith. He's 27th ranked in their system. The Fangraphs doesn't actually have a like breakdown of his value or what he does, just a future value overall. But he's gonna be another solid. I think he's a. This one says he's a pitcher. I thought he was a shortstop, but
No, this is you got the wrong one there.
really, it's for
The
the
Josh
Rangers.
Smith. There's two of them.
Oh, they have two of them. What the heck?
Yes, Josh H. Smith is the one that was traded.
Yeah,
um,
this is super
so
awkward.
yeah, it's very confusing, but he's a guy who has pretty solid all around tools. He's going to be
Here
the
we
number
go.
8 prospect in the
Yeah,
Rangers organization. Um, he's fairly solid all around. He plays shortstop at a decent level. Um, you know, he's fairly raw, but you look at his numbers this year, and in the Yankees and the Rangers organization have both been really good. Obviously, the Rangers, he's only got 16 plate appearances, but the Yankees organization, he's hitting 320, 435, 583 on the season. Although a 411 BABIP can explain some of that, but overall in his career, a really good, really great plate discipline and pretty decent power numbers. So he's really tore up the lower minors, and maybe a guy to look for on the rise a little bit as a guy who's he's 23 years old playing in high A. So that might be he's a little old for his age as a prospect at least, but if he can continue moving up the ladder, he could be a pretty decent looking player. So
Absolutely. Well, let's jump over to the next deal we had, and that was Chicago White Sox making another trade, this time acquiring right-handed relief pitcher Ryan Tepera from the Chicago Cubs for left-handed pitcher Bailey Horn.
yeah, Ryan Capera is a guy who has been a little up and down for his career, but this year has been pretty good. With a 3.07 ERA, his peripherals back that up. His career he's got a career low in walks, walk rate, which is really nice. He's a guy who that's always been a little bit of an Achilles heel for him has been walks. He had a couple solid seasons with the Cubs. Everyone's joked about the MVP vote last
Yeah,
year, the mistake MVP vote, but um, it was interesting move there. You look at the his he's going to help the White Sox bullpen just deeper. I mean that bullpen is sick, especially with one of the later trades we're going to talk about. But yeah, and then Bailey Horn is a interesting guy. He's actually from Auburn. Was picked, I think, in like the fourth or fifth round a couple years ago out of the draft. But he's a guy who was a little inconsistent in college, throwing strikes, but battled an injury at times and got to the pro ball. And his stuff is really good. Throws pretty hard for lefty. Got a nice breaking ball. I think he's probably a future reliever. He can still be a little inconsistent on the strike throwing, and you worry a little bit about him staying healthy too with his injury history. But he's at least an interesting prospect for the Cubs to get back. So I think it's a pretty good trade for a rental 34-year-old soon to be 34-year-old reliever in Ryan Tepera. To get back a guy who's a legit potential major league reliever at some point, Bailey Horn. So
yeah, absolutely. I think it was a very solid trade for either side there. But let's go ahead and jump over to our next one that we had, and that was the Seattle Mariners acquiring relief pitcher Diego Castillo from the Tampa Bay Rays for JT Chagua and Austin Shenton.
yeah, so this is another one that it's not a huge deal, but interesting looking trade for both sides. I mean, Diego Castillo was pitching a lot, was real important to the Rays, who were in first place, but they dealt him away. There's that old saying, never trade with the Rays. So there must be something that there must be something there that was worrying people in the Rays organization. Diego Castillo is a guy who, I mean, this year, I mean, he's been pretty dang good. I mean, there's not much to not like about him. But you look at Austin Shelton, maybe a guy who the Rays really like. I don't think that or Shenton, sorry, I don't think that JT Chargua, I don't even know how to say
Chagua.
his Chagua. I don't know that he's really the main piece in this deal. Um, I mean, he's a guy who's been around a while. In fact, he's yeah, he's just he's pretty average. So he's had a pretty good year this year, but I would definitely rather have Diego Castillo, but you never know with the way that the Rays operate, this guy could end up being a superstar. It's
Yeah,
just one of those things.
yeah, it's just like you said, never traded the Rays. Chagua was a former Dodger, so I got to watch him a little bit. Like you said, it's pretty average, but it seems to like those teams that are advanced in analytics like him for some reason. So maybe the Rays are thinking they can get something out, and I don't know why they traded Diego Castillo. It's really interesting, but we'll come to find that out one day.
Yep.
But let's go ahead and move to the next move, and that was the Dodgers acquiring Danny Duffy and cash for some player to be named later.
Yeah. So Danny Duffy, guy who it's kind of crazy to see him finally get traded. He's been with the Royals his entire career. He was there on their championship team. One of the last, it might be the last player that was there on their championship team. And
Yeah,
he ended up having a couple good years, but he's mainly been kind of a back end of the rotation type of guy. I think the Dodgers are going to pitch him out of the bullpen, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah,
or at
the
least have him kind of as a swingman.
well, the plan right now is supposedly is that he's not going to be ready for until September.
Okay.
Supposedly is what they said, and they're going to build him up through August and see where things are at. They might use him as a spot starter to kind of give somebody a break,
Yeah.
but the plan is at least for October would be for him to be a lefty reliever in the bullpen because they really do lack that, and then letting his stuff kind of play up there.
Yeah, so I mean, he's a guy that for his career, I mean, he's been a starter his whole career for the most part. There's been a couple times that he's moved to the bullpen for several games, but he's mainly been a starter. I mean, a 3.95 career ERA, 4.17 career FIP. I mean, he's a guy who's been pretty good this year. Before his injury, he actually had a 2.51 ERA, although that's a little bit inflated when you look at the peripherals. It still, still peripherals are pretty good, anyways. So he's a guy that maybe you throw him in the bullpen and he does boost his numbers a little bit. But pretty solid move here. They didn't really give up anything. So you get a guy who's at least got some talent that maybe he plays up in the bullpen some can really help your team. So I think it's a good move.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go on to the next kind of blockbuster trade that we had happen, and that was the Yankees acquiring first baseman Anthony Rizzo from the Chicago Cubs for Alexander Vizcaino and Kevin Alcantara.
Yeah, so the more that I look at this trade, I absolutely love this trade for the Cubs. Anthony Rizzo's at the end of his, contract. He's still a good player, don't get me wrong, but he's also, he's about to be 32 years old, I think next week actually. He's a guy who, he's still hitting home runs. His plate discipline numbers are still really good. But he's not hitting the ball with quite as much authority as he once was. His BABIP's been low the last several years. The average is pretty meh. He's still hitting good. Like I say, a 122 WRC plus, 16 home runs on the season. And then you look at you look at his defense has taken a step back this year. But he's a guy who I think is, I think I think he's going to help the Yankees. He's actually already hit a couple home runs for the Yankees, so that's been nice for them. A pretty instant boost for them. They needed first base help pretty bad. But I actually really like this deal for the Cubs because the return they got was two guys who have really high ceilings, a little bit raw, but two guys who are potential future, really really solid major league players. Especially Alcantara, who has ridiculous raw power. He's got a great frame, and he's got speed. And he's a guy who, he's gonna have to work on the hit tool. But if he can do that some, he could end up being a really good player. And then the other guy, Vizcaino, is a guy who can throw 100 miles an hour. So they got a couple of guys who are legitimate, pretty good prospects for 2 months of a pretty old first baseman. So I hate it for the Cubs fans because Rizzo meant so much to them, and he's been a part of that team since before they really started to get good. So it's kind of the end of an era for them, especially with the other guys that got traded. But really, Rizzo was the first one. I mean, he's been a Cub since like 2012 or something.
Yeah.
So he's a guy who I think is I hate it for Cubs fans that they're not going to get to see him play on their team anymore. But I think he's going to help the Yankees, and I think the Cubs really got a great return for him. So I think that was a pretty big win for the Cubs in this trade.
Yeah, and like you said, I think it is a big win for the Cubs. Most Cubs fans aren't going to look at it as one because of the player Anthony Rizzo meant, and not even the player, but just the man that Anthony Rizzo meant to that organization. Like you said, he was there before the really good uptick of that young kind of core came around, and was there through everything. Um, so it was kind of hard and kind of weird to see Rizzo get traded from the Cubs because he kind of just felt like a guy that was going to stick around there for his whole career. But he's having a solid season. He's been hampered with back injuries the past couple years, which has kind of I think led to more of his low BABIP and low average. So that's going to be something they're going to have to kind of watch going forward. But like you said, solid trade for the Yankees. Get a guy. I think it's more. I mean, he's going to get production at first base, but also bringing that kind of a guy into that clubhouse that really needs to make a run for this postseason, for to make the playoffs. Rizzo's a good pickup for that, even. So, and like you said, Alcantara came in. He's going to be the second overall prospect in that Cubs system right now. And then Vizcaino is going to be 12th ranked for that one. But he's a 24-year-old at high A. So,
Yeah, and you got to remember too, with all these trades, the Cubs system has gotten really, really deep.
yeah, it has.
They had a really mediocre system for a long time, and their system, over the past year has gotten a lot better, and it's gotten really deep. So, they may not have the recognized star prospects right now, but anytime you get a group of guys that are like Alcantara and Vizcaino and a couple of the other guys we're going to talk about in a little while, along with some of the guys they got in the offseason in that Yu Darvish trade that were really high ceiling, at least one or two of them is going to end up working out to the point of being a top star looking prospect. Although they also have a guy breaking out, Brendan Davis, in the minors right now. That's been good this year. But some of these guys are going to break out at some point into top prospects. But right now they're kind of stashed, super high ceiling, real volatile, high risk players. But at some point, some of them are going to break out. And I think this is one of those trades that just you get that quantity of really athletic, raw, talented players that some of them are going to figure it out. So I think that's what you're looking at with the Cubs. But our next move on the list is going to be, I believe, we're going to talk about another guy who was a Cub last year, but this year he obviously hasn't been, and it's an injured player, Kyle Schwarber, who got moved to the Red Sox for right-handed pitcher Aldo Ramirez.
Yeah, and Schwarber, like you said, he was injured early on in July. But he's had a really good year, especially that insane month of June. He's batting 253 with a 273 BABIP, but he has 25 homers already. Um, Kind of the guy that he's going to hit middle 200s, 250, get you a lot of power. It was a really interesting move for the Red Sox because the plan is once they bring him back to try and use him at first base, which I don't think he's ever played before.
I
Um,
don't. He hadn't played
so
it to an extended period, at least. He's always played corner outfield, and his first year with Chicago, I believe he caught a little bit, but he's played one game at first base,
yeah,
he was counted as having played one game at first base in 2017, but it looks like he had 0 innings, so I don't know what that's all about. But
yeah.
anyways,
So he's a guy right now, like you said, injured. He has a hamstring injury, so I'm not sure when he's quite supposed to be back. Those can just be a nagging deal. But if if Boston gets him back, I mean they're in a playoff spot right now. He's a good lefty bat that hits for high power. And if they can get him to play a solid first base, I mean this is a win deal for Schwarber, for the Red Sox, and the Nationals, who kind of started their fire sale, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. Get a guy who jumps in as their 8th overall prospect. He's young, 20 years old at A ball. Um, he's really good for throwing command. Has a pretty solid fastball, slider, changeup, thing. So maybe he can be a future reliever. I don't think right now he is a starter, but and he's been pretty solid in the minors. But we'll see how he develops.
yeah, so definitely something to look out for. The returns, just kind of a future reliever. So, but interesting stuff. I do think he will help the Red Sox. So, that was kind of maybe their backup plan for they were looking at Anthony Rizzo for a long time, and that might have been kind of their backup plan. But we're gonna just have to wait and see when he's healthy. I think is kind of the big thing here. But let's move on. Our next move was a pretty interesting move, and that was the Padres finally made a move, and they got right-handed pitcher Daniel Hudson in exchange for right-handed pitcher Mason Thompson and shortstop Jody Barley.
Yeah, Daniel Hudson's a really interesting reliever guy. He's had an up and down career, really battled a lot of injuries. Last year with Washington, or he was a part of that Nationals team that won the World Series, actually closed out the World Series for them. Had a pretty solid year that year, a 2.47 ERA, even though his peripherals didn't back that up quite as much. You look at 2020, he really struggled, even though it's in 20 innings, small sample size, but a 6.10 ERA with a 6.29 FIP and a 5.13 FFIP or XFIP. So that's really really bad. But you look again this year, he's back to a really good reliever. I mean, in 32 innings, he has a 2.20 ERA, a 2.45 FIP, and a 2.88 XFIP. and he's going to that San Diego Padres back at the end of that bullpen. They've had Emilio Pagan and Mark Melanson there, who has been really solid, but the rest of that pen has kind of struggled throughout times. So Hudson, who is really a rental reliever, is having a really good year. Is going to come in and help them, in that bullpen. Mason Thompson's pretty interesting. I was just watching some of the Nationals game yesterday, and he was actually they've called him up, and he was playing as a reliever. Really good fastball. The fastball really rises. Watching him last night, struggles with command and that's really showed. I think he's going to be more of a bullpen arm for the Nationals, but from what I saw last night, he's been pretty solid. This year in the majors, only 4 innings, but he has a 2.25 ERA and a 3.16 FIP, so it seems pretty solid. I don't know much about Barley. I don't know. Do you have anything on him?
Not really. He's a guy who, you know, not especially a top prospect. I think they rated him the number 27, or Fangraphs rated him the number 27 in the Nationals organization now. I mean, he's a guy, he's in low A, and he's got pretty good raw power, but his hit tool is a question mark. He's got pretty good speed, so maybe a little bit of a toolsy prospect. If you can fix the swing, he could end up, having a little bit higher ceiling than most guys like that. But he's really mainly a throw in. I think the bigger piece was Thompson, and neither one of them are high likelihood, good big leaguers, but both of them, are maybe guys who have, pretty good ceilings. So, um, interesting move there. Both, a couple top 30 prospects for a reliever who's really having his first, you know, at least when it comes to his peripherals and stuff, legit good year. I know he had that great ERA back in 2019, but he really wasn't that good when you look at his peripherals that year. And this year he's backed up his results, which have been really good with great peripherals this year. Is he's got a career low walk rate, career high strikeout rate, not giving up as many home runs. I mean, he's been really good this year. So, um, yeah, Jody Barley's also a shortstop, so kind of interesting to see there. We'll see what happens. Maybe a high ceiling type guy might figure it out at some point, but you never know. Our next move, though, couple pretty minor moves that were somewhat interesting. Actually, a few here in a row. We've got Freddie Galvis got moved to the Phillies, back to the Phillies, because he'd been there before from Pittsburgh. I mean, from Baltimore for a right-handed pitcher, Tyler Birch. So, it's a low minors pitcher, maybe a future reliever. I don't know, but Freddie Galvis is a great player, so they got something for him. You look at the next trade. Michael Chavis, who's a former top prospect, got moved to the Pirates for a pitcher with a 5+ ERA. So that's kind of interesting that neither one of them probably going to contribute too much, but definitely interesting. Chavis, if you remember, was pretty good as a rookie. Kind of burst onto the scene and then had some trouble with, I believe he had a PED suspension, and then the other one is kind of interesting. Jake Marisnick got moved for Anderson Espinosa, who was a pretty highly rated prospect at one time for San Diego, but his stock's taken a pretty good hit. Jake Marisnick will help them as maybe a fourth outfielder type. So, a few interesting moves right there.
Yeah, and then like you said, pretty interesting. Galvis isn't going to be; he's just going to be a rotational like infielder
Yeah.
utility guy. Marisnick's going to be that fourth or fifth type outfielder. Chavis is pretty interesting. He was a former top prospect that, like you said, got moved for a guy with a 5 ERA. So it's pretty interesting with all of those. I would say it's not really the next major move, but the next kind of move that's going to be impactful is the Atlanta Braves acquiring Eddie Rosario and cash from the Cleveland Indians for Pablo Sandoval.
Yeah, the Braves actually made a few moves that were kind of all the same type of moves. In fact, they acquired, when you include the Jock Peterson deal, they acquired 4 corner outfielders.
Yeah.
So obviously, with the injury to Ronald Acuna Jr. and the legal issues for Marcelo Zuna, which there's actually been some news, some movement on that in the last couple of weeks, but we won't get into that right now. But they they've had a big hole in the outfield, and these moves are going to help that. Eddie Rosario is a guy who at times has been a really good hitter, hit for power for the Twins, and he was on a cheap deal for the Indians, a 1 year deal this year, and he um, got traded to the Atlanta Braves for Pablo Sandoval, who was like one for his last 40 or something and struggling. But the main thing was they just basically the Indians got the Braves to pay half the rest of his salary, Rosario's salary, and they immediately DFA'd Pablo Sandoval. So um, that was interesting. And then you look at a few more. We can go ahead and look at a few more trades that the Braves made because they're all kind of right together. Adam Duvall got moved for Alex Jackson. So that was interesting. Adam Duvall, obviously a Brave, last year and the year before. Guy who's going to hit for a lot of power, not too much else. He's actually been really good defensively this year. I think he had something like 12 DRS before defensive run saved before the trade. So that was interesting. Got moved for Alex Jackson, who, if nobody knows, is a guy who was a very highly sought after draft prospect, but has bounced around a lot, and he hits for a lot of power. The hit tool's a big question mark, but he's actually improved enough to where a lot of people think he can stick at catcher now. So if he can ever figure out enough contact, he could be like an everyday type player. And then they got Jorge Soler for Casey Kalick. Soler is a guy who 2 years ago hit 49 home runs, but he's a guy who also he's had some rough stretches at times. Started off horrible this year, but has really got hot as of late. So he's a free agent at the end of the year, but interesting move for the Braves. Pick him up. He's actually been pretty good since the trade. He got moved for Casey Kalick, who's a pitching prospect that is probably a future reliever. Don't know if he'll make it to the big leagues or not. And then the biggest trade that they made was Richard Rodriguez, the Pirates closer, got moved for Bryce Wilson, who had been pitching in the big leagues at times, kind of been one of the guys that's bounced back and forth between the AAA and the big leagues, and a guy who's had some big starts. He started a game in the playoffs for Atlanta last year, but he's never really found his footing at the big league level. He was in it, and along with another reliever prospect, Ricky DeVito. So definitely some interesting moves. The Braves needed to address their corner outfield and their bullpen, and they did that with these moves. So I think it's going to help them.
Yeah, they're trying to make a push for that wild card spot with the Mets struggling and the Phillies not really doing much at the deadline, and I think the Braves kind of smell blood in the water a little bit, and even without Acuna, they're trying to go for it. Although I don't know quite how much that's going to help them because they don't have Acuna, but or Ozuna right now. Maybe they get him back, but like
Yeah.
you said, a couple interesting moves. Bryce Wilson, I think he's going to the Pirates. He'll have an opportunity to maybe work out as a starter again. He's really struggled like so far in the majors, but maybe he gets that opportunity and shines a little bit. Like you said, a couple solid moves for the Braves, and like I said, I think they just kind of smell blood in the water and kind of make some moves. And there aren't any major moves, but they're solid moves that didn't really cost much.
Yeah, and you got to remember too, one of the things that I kind of stressed with some of these teams that were kind of on the borderline of buying and selling. The Yankees were another one that hasn't had a great year. They're not a lock to make the postseason. Is get guys with control, so that way next year you can, they're really going to help you. It's not just for the outside chance that you make the playoffs this year. And the Braves ended up getting Richard Rodriguez. Is going to be a key piece of the bullpen for the next, as long as things go to plan for the next 2 years after this year. He's under control, and that same goes for the Yankees moving for Joey Gallo is another guy who's under control for a while. So that a couple pretty big moves there, but the control part of it helps a lot too for those moves. So in fact, and I was looking it up a minute ago, the Braves are 2.5 games out of the division now after the Mets lost again tonight. So um, it's that division's starting to get really tight again. So interesting stuff there. But another trade that we had, in fact, it's a trade that I think a lot of people kind of thought it would be made. Joaquin Soria got moved for a couple of player to be named later. He's going to Toronto, I believe, right?
Yeah.
I didn't even write it down. And it's for players to be named later, but everyone kind of expected him to get moved. I feel like he gets moved a lot at the deadline, but
It's because he's a veteran
He's a
bullpen
pretty
arm.
yeah, he's a pretty good middle reliever, so he
Yeah.
gets moved a lot. But good stuff there. That'll help the bullpen in Toronto. Of course, we saw the trade earlier with Brad Hand, and they needed to get a couple guys to help that pin out, and they did. So
Yeah. Well, let's jump over to the next trade we had, and that was the New York Yankees acquiring Andrew Heaney and cash from the Angels for right-handed pitcher Jansen Junk, my bad, and Elvis Peguero.
yeah, so Andrew Haney is a guy who at times has been really good, but this year it's been a struggle for him. Really, the issue he has is the home run ball. This year he's had a career low ground ball percentage. He's only getting a ground ball on 32% of his of contact against him, and 1.84 home runs per nine has been his downfall this year, and that's kind of been his thing in the past too. Not get a lot of balls on the ground, and in return, a lot of fly balls means a lot of home runs. So, um, he's a guy who gets a lot of strikeouts and doesn't walk a ton of guys. So, maybe if he can figure out keeping the ball down a little bit better, maybe he can do some pretty good work. But he's kind of a middle to back end of the rotation type of starter, and he's going to help lengthen that rotation in New York. So.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things, which I don't want to spend too much time on it, but maybe it's a good thing for him to get out of the Angels system and kind of everything that has happened there. As he was one of his best friends was Tyler Skaggs,
Yes.
which we know that unfortunately passed away a couple years ago. But I think it's a very good deal for him to kind of get a fresh start. I feel like that's kind of weighed a burden on him a little bit, kind of being there. Haney's a guy who I've always thought was going to be better than he really is. And I don't really love the fit with him going to New York because he gives up a lot of fly balls.
Yeah.
Um,
That's what I was
and
about to say.
in a bandbox in Yankee Stadium, it's kind of not the best place for him. But who knows? Maybe he'll find something. I believe he's a free agent at the end of the year. Is he not?
Think so.
Yeah, I believe he is. The return's not too great. I mean, Junk is the 29th overall prospect in the Angels system, and the Angels don't have a great system. He's a 25-year-old at Double A. Seems like he throws a good curveball, has really good command. Kind of is going to be. He's a starter right now, but if he prototypes for anything, it's going to be a bullpen arm. Peguero is a little bit more interesting. He was a guy who was going to be actually was in the original Joey Gallo trade before it had to be revised. He is a prototypical bullpen arm all the way. Good fastball, good slider, good command. Just he's 24-year-old at Double A. Doesn't have much future value per Fangraphs as well, but 28th overall in the Angels system. I think he's a hard thrower if I'm not mistaken. I don't
I
know
mean,
where his
he's
exact.
a he's I think he's got their Fangraphs graded his fastball as a 60. So I mean, he's throws pretty hard, but not kind of elite, but definitely a couple guys. And you look at Jansen Junk, and he's got pretty good numbers this year. So interesting stuff for both those guys. Neither one of them are too big of a deal, but they're guys who they're at least somewhat interesting, and you're really not moving that much. So the next trade we have on our list. Kind of interesting trade as well. Jan Gomes and Josh Harrison, part of the fire sale from the Nationals. They got moved for catching prospect Drew Millas, right-handed pitcher Seth Schumann, and right-handed pitcher Richard Gauch.
Yeah, so Jan Gomes is actually having one of his better seasons that he's ever had. Batting 274 with a 325 on base. His batting average from balls and plays a 307. He's a he's one of those guys at catcher who isn't going to bring me much offensive production, although he has been doing more solid this year. Doesn't walk much, doesn't strike out that often. Just a solid overall veteran catcher. Going to the Oakland A's there. Josh Harrison is a guy who has been around forever. I mean, since 2011 he's having I think this has been his career best season actually, a 292 with a 364 on base. um, and he's just a good utility guy. He can play pretty much everywhere. I think he plays all the outfield spots, maybe not center so much these days, although he has 2 games there this year, but he plays second, left, third, and some of the right field. But Oakland is kind of the move that they do: utility guys or just veteran, a catcher that can come in, and then they'll be pretty solid for him this year. And they didn't give up all that much for him because I believe both of these are rentals. That'll be free
Yeah.
agents at the end of the year, but pretty solid pickup for two solid veteran pickups for the Oakland A's.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're solid pickups. And that wasn't for no cost. Drew Molas is a fairly interesting catcher. He's got good plate discipline numbers in the low minors, and he's graded pretty well as a defender at catcher. He's actually going to be the number 13 prospect for the Nationals, although their system is pretty weak still, especially in the depth wise. But interesting guy for sure. But yeah, I mean, Jan Gomes, I think he can still be a pretty good, at least most days catcher. He's not going to catch 162 games, but he can catch 2 out of 3 probably still at a pretty high level. And then Josh Harrison, like you said, pretty good, having a great year. It was for the Nationals, but guy who I think is a good utility fit. He'll probably play just about every day, but he might not play the same position every day. So pretty solid little trade there for both sides, really. But our next move was a little bit of a bigger move than that one, and that was the Phillies made a move. This was really the only big trade the Phillies made, and they went out and got Kyle Gibson, Ian Kennedy, and Hans Kraus for right-handed pitcher Spencer Howard, right-handed pitcher Kevin Gowdy, and right-handed pitcher Jos Gessner, I believe is how you say it.
Bless you.
So,
Yeah, Gibson, he was an interesting player to look at this deadline because he's having his career year for sure. A 2.86 ERA, a 3.68 FIP, so that the ERA doesn't kind of back up what the peripheral say. Um, he's just been a really solid guy. He's kind of been interesting throughout his career. He's had some really bad years and a couple solid years. Um, I don't think he kind of fits that well in Philadelphia. Um, I just something about it with Citizens Bank Ballpark. It's more of a bandbox than most people think it is. I mean, he's half ground ball guy, so that will help. But
the Phillies defense, though, my
yeah,
God,
that's the
they're
part. Their defense with that ground ball rate, it's
they've
just going to
got.
be
Yeah,
terrible.
you look at them around the horn, and you got Hoskins is playing first. He's horrible defensively.
Yeah,
You've got Didi
Segura.
Gregorius, who's really not good at shortstop, playing there defensively. And then Alec Bohm might be the worst defensive third baseman in baseball. So you got 3 out of your 4 infield spots are just totally atrocious on defense.
Yeah, and
So
then you look at Ian Kennedy. I mean, the Philly needed help in that bullpen big time. If you look at strictly ERA, he's having a good season, but you look at his FIP and it's 4.29. That doesn't really back up his 3.41. Although the xFIP kind of backs it up a little bit more with the 3.87. Um, but Ian Kennedy, I mean, he only has a 27.8 ground ball rate, so he's a guy who's going to give up a bunch of fly balls. That really doesn't play well in that bullpen or in that park either. Um, Overall, it's a solid trade. I mean, two veteran arms that are both going to be. No, actually, Gibson has an extra year of control,
yeah,
um,
he's got next year. So
but Kennedy's going to be a free agent this year. Kraus, I hadn't really looked him up much until just a little bit ago, but good fastball, good curveball, a solid changeup, and his command is really what lacks. It doesn't look like there's a lot of projectability to him. It kind of looks like what he is what he is right now. Um, I mean, they have him as a starter at the moment, but I mean, maybe that comes in. Spencer Howard was a really interesting one to I think to give up on so early though.
yeah, Spencer Howard's a guy. I've never been a huge believer in Spencer Howard. Um, I just don't, after seeing him in the at the minor league level and at the major league level. I mean, he's just not. He just it just seems like he doesn't really have it at the major league level. But you look at you look at a guy who, I mean, he's only thrown what, he threw six games last year, and then this year he's thrown in 11 games. So he's a young guy who really hasn't pitched that much in the big leagues, and a former top prospect. Um, so and he's still a top prospect. I don't think he's graduated from the list yet. So he's the number 56 prospect overall according to Fangraphs. And he was, he was number one for the Phillies, and he's number one, I believe, for the Rangers too. Now I think he's rated ahead of Josh Young. So he's a guy who is, he's pretty. He's got a chance to be a good pitcher still. But you know, you look at him and then you know for this trade, I think it's probably fair value. You're getting a couple of guys who are fairly coveted on the market. I'm not a huge believer in Kyle Gibson, like some people are. And then Ian Kennedy, I think is just kind of a average middle reliever who probably helps that bullpen a pretty good bit, but I don't think he's a game changer in that bullpen. So, interesting stuff from both of them. But I don't especially love this trade from the Phillies, and I think it's kind of a no brainer for the Rangers. Get what you can for it. So, although Spencer Howard's not especially my favorite prospect, so
Yeah, but it was a pretty interesting trade at least. Well, let's move on to, I think this could probably be the biggest move that was made this deadline. Um, it's going to seem a little biased me saying that, but I mean, maybe you can back
I
that
mean
up.
it is.
Okay, so it's not me being biased here. But that was the Los Angeles Dodgers acquiring Max Scherzer and Trea Turner from the Washington Nationals for catcher Kyber Ruiz, right-handed pitcher Josiah Gray, right-handed pitcher Gerardo Carrillo, and outfielder Donovan Casey.
Yeah, so this trade is obviously a blockbuster. You're talking about a guy who, multi-time Cy Young winner, um, who has started the All-Star game on several occasions, including this year. In Max Scherzer, he's one of the best pitchers of our generation. He's up to, I think he's nearing, or has he gotten 3,000 strikeouts?
I don't
I'm not sure if he's
know.
hit
I
it
will
or
look
hit
that up.
3,000 or not. I'm looking it up real quick, but yeah, he's a guy who he's obviously for his career has been incredible. A future Hall of Famer, no doubt. Um, and then he's actually he's 69 strikeouts away from 3,000, so he's going to get there, but not yet. uh he's a guy though, he's dealt with some injuries this year. At times he's missed some games. He's still throwing a lot of innings, but you look at him as a guy who's not quite as good as he was 2, 3, 4 years ago, when every year he was penciled in for a mid twos ERA or better, and close to 300 strikeouts every year. Um, so he's still good, but this year, a 3.59 ERA or 3.59 FIP, although he does have a 2.76 ERA, which is really good. He's still I don't know if he's still a number one, but he's definitely a number two at this stage. But I think the bigger part of it, because of the control that comes with him, is Trea Turner, who has really become one of the best shortstops in the game the last couple of years. I thought this was a really interesting guy to get for the Dodgers because we don't know what's going to happen with Corey Seager after this year. But Trea Turner, is a speedster on the base paths, but he's kind of turned into a better all around hitter. Um, he hit 335 last year, although it's kind of inflated with the shortened season. But this year he's really backed that up to a certain level. He's hit 322. He's hit a lot of power this year. 4 wins above replacement already on the year. He's been one of the best shortstops in the game for the last couple years, and he's a guy who obviously you get him for 2 more years after this year, and then obviously with the Dodgers situation, depending on if they re-sign him or not, he could be there a long time. The return though was huge for these guys.
Yeah, the return starts with Kyber Ruiz, who is, or I would say actually starts with Josiah Gray. The way you look at it, he'll be their number one prospect in their organization right now. Per Fangraphs, he's number 20 overall, but he's actually up. He got called up and actually made the start yesterday for them, and actually, I think he went 5 innings of one-run ball. I think he gave up a solo homer at one point to Abdul Herrera, but Josiah Gray, he's a guy who came over to the Dodgers in the trade with Yasiel Puig and Matt Kemp and all that to the Reds, and he became the organization pitcher of the year. Um, he had a couple starts with the Dodgers this year. I mean, was okay, but he's a guy who will really attack the zone. He'll give up home runs because he really wants to attack the zone. Um, Solid fastball, solid slider, solid changeup, decent with command. He's going to be more of a 2 to 3 guy, most likely. Um, and if anything, he'll be a back of the rotation type guy. Kybert Ruiz, he's going to come in and be their number 2 ranked prospect. So, I mean, both of these guys come in as number 1 and number 2 in this organization, even though you said it lacks a little bit of a depth. Um, per Fangraphs, he's 41st overall. So you're looking at two top 50 prospects that they got. Um, Kybert should get the call up a little bit later this year. Had limited action in the majors. I believe it's like 15 at bats. He's only hit 200, but he has a couple home runs. He's a guy who's going to be known for his hit tool a little bit more than his fielding. Not very fast, solid fielding guy. Overall, he'll be a pretty good regular catcher. He'll never be that superstar guy, but most likely, one of the top 10 catchers in baseball, most likely.
Yeah.
Carrillo, or go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say I'd second both of those guys. I mean, I think Josiah Gray's got a lot of potential, got good stuff. And then you look at Kybert Ruiz, and I think the big question for him is the power going to develop some? Because I think that at one time people were thinking the the power would start to come, but it still has yet to come. Too much. So, uh, although he's a guy who's going to hit for a really high average. He doesn't just refuses to strike out. So, which is a good trait for a catcher to have. He's going to definitely be a useful offensive player and play a decent catcher. So,
Yeah,
um,
he had showed some of that power this year. He's already had 16 homers at AAA.
yeah,
So, and like you
definitely
said,
better than he has been.
yeah, and he's a guy who will walk and strike out about the same amount of times. So,
Yeah.
Casey's kind of a throw-in guy. He's a 25-year-old outfielder. Not really much projection going on there. Carrillo is going to be pretty interesting. Kind of profiles more as a reliever. Good fastball, solid slider. Struggles with command, kind of overall. But Josiah Gray and Kybert Ruiz are the two big main people
Oh, no
here.
doubt. Yeah. So, and you would expect for a elite shortstop with 2 years left on his deal, and for an all-star pitcher, although he's a rental, you'd expect to get two top 40 prospects for that, including one of the better catching prospects in the game who is really having a good year this year. So, definitely something that you would expect to see for that. And I think the return justified the trade is a big return. So.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump over to our next trade. You kind of hinted on it a little bit ago with that Ryan Tepera, but that's the White Sox acquired Craig Kimbrell from the Cubs for second baseman Nick Madrigal and relief pitcher Cody Hewer.
Yeah, so this was a pretty big time trade. Craig Kimbrell has been really good this year. It's been the best year he's had since really, honestly, he had a great year in 2017, but this year has honestly been his best year since his Atlanta days. He
This is probably
he
his
has
best
been
career year.
it might be. I mean, he has been absolutely incredible. I do think that maybe like 2012, his peripherals were a little bit better than they are this year. But not by much. But he's a guy who is back to his old ways. He's doing it a little bit differently. He's throwing a few more breaking balls now than he used to. So that's something that to watch a little bit. He's a guy who used to just be fastball, 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 and he still throws a lot of fastballs, but the breaking balls have kind of gone up. And his key to his success has been his improved walk rate because his last 3 years he had gotten really wild and had lost a lot of his ability to throw strikes, and that led to a dreadful 2019 and then a very mediocre 2020. But this year he's just been incredible. And what's happened is that he, because of being so good this year, has been able to net a really nice return for a guy who is getting paid, even though he does have a team option next year, which I would assume would probably be picked up the way he's pitched this year. He's getting paid pretty highly. He's probably maybe not quite as high as his value, but he's getting paid like an elite reliever. So you know there's not too much surplus value there, but he did net back Nick Madrigal, who is really he's the opposite of Joey Gallo, but maybe not near as maybe even as much polarizing as Joey Gallo, although he's the complete opposite.
Yeah, so Madrigal, he'll come in as the team's third ranked prospect, 36 overall in baseball per Fangraphs. But like you said, complete opposite of Joey Gallo, who doesn't make contact with very high power. Madrigal makes all the contact in the world with very little power. Has solid speed, solid fielding. He's projected. Um, he's very much projected to be an everyday second baseman. Just it's kind of weird this return. I guess if them trading Madrigal must mean that they want to pick up that option because he's a highly sought after prospect. He's out for the year due to a hamstring injury, which kind of hit on that a little bit ago with Cesar Hernandez. But he's a guy who everywhere he's been has really batted over 300. Um, kind of run a pretty high BABIP because he just always puts the ball in play. He's going to steal some bases. He's going to play really solid defense. He's going to be kind of your kind of lead off guy per se. And then Hewer or Hoyer, I don't know how to exactly say it. He's a reliever that has a really good fastball, really good slider, and a pretty solid changeup that kind of struggles with command a little bit.
Yeah, so I think you hit it really well there. You look at Madrigal, and um, I like Madrigal. I think there's a lot more value to what he does than is I think a lot of people realize. But the problem is that I really don't think he fits the Cubs timeline, because the Cubs are going out there and getting all these, really young prospects planning for the future. And Madrigal's kind of a, next 3 or 4 years type player. So I thought that was kind of interesting to look at. But we'll see what happens here. You're going to start to see this return next year. And the Cubs are going to have an interesting, very interesting, and probably exciting middle infield in Nick Madrigal and Nico Horner, who are a couple kind of throwback style players. So that'll be interesting to look at going forward. The next trade we had, probably the most lopsided trade when it comes to value that we had, I think.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And one trade that I don't think we really, if you would have talked to us last week when we were recording this, we probably didn't see this move coming. And that was Jose Berrios being traded to the Toronto Blue Jays for infield outfielder Austin Martin and pitcher Simeon Woods Richardson.
Yeah, so you look at Berrios, and he's good. I want to get that out of the way. Berrios is good. For his career, he's had every single season except for last year's shortened season, fielding independent pitching under 4 and an ERA under 4. So he's been really good. A guy who this year, a 3.31 ERA and 127 innings. He's been durable. He hasn't been injured much. He threw 200 innings 2019, 192 innings 2018, and obviously before that, he's a rookie. So young guy. He's got another year of control after this year. Another one of those guys that you look at kind of like the Braves move for Richard Rodriguez, the Yankees move for Joey Gallo. A couple teams that are kind of on the fringe of the playoffs. Kind of building for not just the rest of this year, but also for next year. This is another one. But man, they gave up some guys who were really surprising for them to give up for Jose Barrios. They gave up their first round pick from, I believe, last year, might have been year
It
before
was
last, in
2020.
Austin, 2020. Okay,
Yep.
and Austin Martin, who is a pretty much, I believe, a consensus top 20 prospect in baseball, maybe
He's
top.
he's fallen a little bit
He's
this
fallen
year.
on Fangraphs, I see, but
Yeah,
he's a guy who has been rated extremely highly by most services in his, as a young guy in his career. I mean, he's been moved up to Double A in his first year of full of pro ball this year, and the power is not quite there, but I mean, he's got 132 WRC plus and a 15% walk rate. So that's pretty solid. And he also plays a premium position at a decent level.
yeah. That's
Um,
the
and
that's kind of the reason he's fallen is because they're not quite sure that his defense is going to be able to allow him to stick at shortstop.
yeah,
That's kind of
so
why he's fallen a little bit.
yeah, so it makes sense. But even if he does end up in the outfield, and he could probably play a nice center field, apparently, according to a lot of the people and that who have or a lot of the things I've read, and his bat will work at either place. as long as it continues to progress at the level it has so far. So he, he's a definitely a high rated prospect. And then they also got Simeon Woods Richardson, who I thought it was interesting that he got traded because he's actually not in the U.S. right now. He's in Tokyo in the Olympics. He's on the Olympic team. So um, I thought that was a really interesting move. But he's actually a 20-year-old man born in. He was
2000.
born in 2000, but he's a guy who in Double A, his walk rate's a little high this year, but that hadn't really been a problem for him in his career. He was part of the Marcus Stroman trade a couple years ago to when he went to Toronto. But a guy who has good stuff across the board, and a top 50 overall prospect, as is Austin Martin on most services at least. So um, they got two top 50-ish prospects for a guy who's probably a number 2 or number 3 pitcher. So I think that, and with only 1 year of control left, although he's not a rental, so I thought that was a very big haul that they got back. Although it's not without risk with these two prospects.
Yeah, I very much agree with you on Berrios being 2 and 3. Um, like I said, Martin, I think he's fallen a lot in the eyes because of the defensive, um, the lack of a clear defensive position for him. Although being number 5 overall pick, last year he's only played in 55 games. So how much can you really tell about that? Um, Simeon Woods Richardson's a guy who is very, very interesting to me. He's been one of my favorite prospects um, since he came into the league. He always runs a super low FIP and XFIP compared to what his ERAs really have said. Um, so he's a guy that I'm very much interested. I think he could be a top of the rotation type arm for Minnesota. Come in and maybe even be a potential ace one day. And he's still extremely young at 20. Big guy, 6'3", 210. So very interesting that he was traded. This is a return that you would think would get traded for an ace with an extra year of control, and not a guy like Berrios who will be a 2 and 3. But there was kind of a bidding war for him. That's kind of what happens. I mean, the Padres were in on it. I believe the Red Sox were even in on it. And then the Blue Jays ended up winning out on it. So that's kind of what you get when you get these bidding wars at the trade deadline. Sometimes it's better to take the guy and trade him now. And like you said, they're going to have an extra year of control, and probably I would assume try to either lock him up or give him the qualifying offer at the end of next year, and maybe get a
Yeah,
draft pick back for him or whatever. So
yeah, no doubt. So
let's
um,
let's go ahead and move on to our next one. We'll have a couple more trades. I know we've already gone long on this, but we want to definitely bring you guys these next two ones. That's the Mets acquiring Javier Baez and Trevor Williams for Chicago Cubs for outfielder Pete Crow Armstrong.
yeah, so this is a move that I think that the Mets, it makes sense to the point that you've got a vacancy at shortstop with Francisco Lindor being out for the rest of, or for most of the rest of the year, although he's probably going to be back sometime. It's late September. But you've got they got Javier Baez, who I think it's real well chronicled. I think everyone knows him. 36% strikeout rate this year is a career high, outside of his 52 game rookie stint back in 2014. He doesn't walk. He's got probably the worst approach at the plate in the big leagues. But he hits for power still. 23 home runs this year. He's actually averaged out for this year to be a league average hitter. He's very good defensively, uh, especially at shortstop. But he can also play. He can also play second base at a high level, which he's done in the past. So that was kind of a thing the Mets were, glad that he was comfortable there because they can always move him over when Lindor comes back. Definitely an interesting player to get. He's a rental, but and then Trevor Williams I think is already in AAA. I think they optioned him, and he's not really that good. So, but this is really a Javier Baez for Pete Crow Armstrong.
Yeah, and Pete Crow Armstrong, I believe he was the 19th overall pick in
Yes.
2020. Guy who prototypes as a really just defensive outfielder with really good speed. Pretty solid raw power, but that really isn't going to come over to the game as much. And a decent hit tool. I mean, you're trading for him because he's going to be one of those kind of Kevin Pillar or Kevin Kiermaier type guys in the outfield, I would assume. Maybe not as good defensively as those two, but I mean, they're a guy who he'll probably make enough contact, and he's going to play a really good center field for you. And maybe they can develop some of that raw power into some game power eventually.
Yeah, I think this is a good prospect to get back. He's a first round pick last year, so I think there's a lot of development to go on there. But the Mets felt good enough about him to throw him on into A ball this year as a former as a high school guy that was picked in last year's draft. So that's a pretty nice that's a pretty good look, and I think a lot of people like his makeup a lot too. But he only played in 6 games because of an injury that happened. But when he played, he had a good approach at the plate, 22% walk rate in his 6 games. So that really doesn't mean that much small sample size, but at least he was willing to take walks for a little while, even though he wasn't there long. But you look at a guy who, I mean, I think he could end up being a good player, high ceiling type guy. He's got a great frame. 6 foot 184. He's pretty well built. As you said, fantastic defensive center fielder, hits from the left side of the plate. Maybe he can improve on that raw power a little. I mean, on that game power a little bit with some swing changes, get the ball lofted a little bit more. And I think this is a guy who, if all things go the way that it appears, the hitting tool will improve and continue to make progress. So I think it's a very good deal for the Cubs because I really am not a huge believer in Baez at this point, and I think he's got a skill set that's going to fall in his remaining years, as he's primarily a defensive player who relies on his athletic ability more than anything else. So I don't, so, obviously him being a rental, but, helps this too. But, 2 months of a shortstop who's been up and down at times, who's been real streaky. 2 months of him for a guy who was a first round pick last year and has a really high ceiling. I think it's a good move for the Cubs.
Yeah, it's a pretty solid move, and like you say, he's a rental that probably there has already been some talks that there wasn't much of a with really any of these Cubs guys. There wasn't much of a dialogue of seriously about being able to re-sign. They were pretty far off on
Yeah.
contract talks. So Javi, and the thing is Lindor is one of Javi's best friends. So that will make
Yes,
it a little
that
bit
was
more
big.
comfortable with him going there. And he had already said that he would only play second base if it was on the Mets with Lindor. So that's the thing. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Mets probably re-sign him, um, you know, in the offseason for something. But that we'll talk about more of that when the offseason comes around and stuff. But let's go ahead and jump over to the last trade that we're going to talk about today, and that is the San Francisco Giants acquiring Kris Bryant from the Chicago Cubs for Alexander Canario and Caleb Killian.
Yes. So this trade, it was interesting. I think a lot of Cubs fans were underwhelmed by the return, but when you look into it, I do think the return is pretty decent. Kris Bryant's a guy who has battled injuries so much in the last couple of years, and it's been no different this year. So he's a guy that teams are going to get as a rental, and I think they're a little bit worried to rely on him the rest of the year because I think there's a chance when you get a guy like Kris Bryant that he just doesn't play that much with the injuries he's had the last couple of years. But when he does play, he's still really good. This year a 132 WRC plus says it all. 19 home runs, 266 average, 358 on base, walks a lot. His strikeouts are they're fairly high, but not impossibly high. I mean, maybe a little higher than average on the strikeouts, but he's still a very useful player. I think the biggest thing for Kris Bryant that's been so remarkable is his ability to move around as this all-star level player and play a lot of different positions. I mean, he's a guy who for his career is most well known as a third baseman, but he's also played a lot of he's played a lot of outfield too, left field a ton. He's played right field a lot. He's even played center a little bit. And you can always throw him over at first base too. So he's a guy who can really play four positions, and in a pinch, you could probably throw him into center and he'd be okay. So um, I think he's a very interesting player for the Giants to get, and I think it's a perfect fit because the Giants are a team that has a lot of veterans, and a lot of guys that you want to get rest. So if you got a guy that with the utility that Kris Bryant has, on that day that you can move him around some. When Brandon Belt needs a day off at first, you can throw Kris Bryant over at first, keep him in the lineup, and you've got veterans elsewhere that can handle where Kris Bryant typically would play, or when you get a guy like at Evan Longoria, I don't know how much longer he's out or if he's still out, but
He's still
um,
out.
yeah, so you got a guy like Evan Longoria. If he comes back, you've got him at third, and Kris Bryant can slide in and play third when you need him to, or outfield. Or he can do a little bit of everything. So, I think this is a very good trade for the Giants. I like them getting Kris Bryant, making that move. They didn't really give up a super high level prospect for him. They gave up a couple interesting guys for sure, but it's 2 months of a guy who you don't know if you can rely on for the rest of the year because of injury potential. But it's also a guy that you could very well carry a team through the rest of the year. So
Yeah, Killian. The return that they got with him is he's a 25 overall in the Cubs system. He's a guy who's really known for command. Really doesn't pop anything off with a fastball, slider, curveball, changeup type mix. Um, he's just going to be kind of. I've seen a lot of comparisons. I know it's going to be kind of unfair, but to a Kyle Hendricks
yeah,
kind of guy, which it's kind of unfair to compare anybody to Kyle Hendricks, but that's sort of what you're looking at, style pitcher wise, is the guy who can just place the ball wherever he wants, really. Canario or Canario or however you say it, he's a guy who is really big power, 60 game power, 60 raw power projected by Fangraphs. Seems solid fielding, solid speed, pretty young still, 21. But he is at high A, so he'll have to start progressing pretty soon. But it seems like the Cubs, they did a good job overall on their haul uh, for this deadline. You could say the Bryant trade was maybe a little underwhelming. I mean, I know a lot of people were expecting like a Joey Bart, but I didn't think that was ever really a
yeah,
a realistic idea. They did pretty solid. They have a deep system now, and they seem to target guys, like Canario, who has really big power that they can try to develop.
yeah.
So
I think the Cubs have done a fantastic job of getting a lot of raw guys who have high potential.
yeah,
Now, it's not without risk, but we've seen a lot of teams that have feasted off of that the last few years. Teams like the Braves went out and got a lot of guys with a lot of risk, but a lot of potential. You look at the Padres. I mean, Fernando Tatis Jr. was one of these guys, and I'm not sitting here saying that one of these Cubs players is going to turn into a Fernando Tatis Jr., but a lot of times these teams will go with that safe back end of the top 100 type guy with a pretty high floor but low ceiling, who's a pretty safe bet to be some kind of big leaguer. And a lot of times that ends up turning into a lot of fairly average players who do make it to the big leagues. But some of these guys they have will never make the big leagues, but also they might get two or three of them that turn into stars in the big leagues. So interesting stuff. I like what they did, and as you said, this Killian guy I think is really interesting because um, you know we've seen several times the last few years some of these guys with the really really high graded command. You think about Kyle Hendricks as a comp, but how about like a guy like Shane Bieber? He was a guy who came
yeah,
out with like 70 grade command, and people were not super sold on the stuff, and he just kind of kept progressing. His stuff got a little bit kept getting a little bit better and a little bit better to the point to where you combine it with the command that he has, and he's turned into an ace level pitcher. So it's one of those things where you never know what might happen. But the crazy stat about this guy is that in the minor leagues, he has thrown in his over he's thrown over 100 innings in his minor league career, I believe. Maybe right at 100 innings. And he had, in fact, I think he's thrown exactly 100 innings, but he's only had 10 walks. 11 walks, excuse me. He's thrown 11 walks in about 100 innings in his minor league career. So that's a pretty impressive statistic. And you look at he's also strikes out a lot of guys so far. Of course, he's in the low minors until this year in Double A, but he's got excellent numbers. So we'll see how the stuff plays at the big league level. But I think this is a pretty interesting looking move for the Cubs. And then another guy, Killian. I mean, Canario. I mean, I like him too, but he's another one of those risky high strikeout. Is he going to figure out how to hit guys that you just never know? So definitely interesting stuff. A lot of teams made out well in this trade deadline. One thing that we did want to mention real quick is the one guy that didn't get traded, and that was Trevor Story. I think a lot of people were shocked that he didn't get traded.
Yeah.
I think that maybe the return for him, as since he hadn't had a great year this year, I think that the Rockies were kind of thinking the returns for him that were being offered not were really comparable to the potential draft pick compensation draft pick they'll get. So I think that's why they didn't trade him. So that's interesting. It'll remain to be seen what they do with that comp pick they get, or potentially what they do with that bonus pool money they get from having a comp pick. They could always sign an under slot guy in that pick and have more money to spend on their first rounder. But I thought that was very interesting to look at. And John Gray didn't get traded either. A lot of people were talking about him too. So the Rockies really didn't make too many moves here, which was pretty interesting. But
Yeah.
that's a team that's caught a lot of criticism for stuff like that. So
Yeah, I mean, even Story came out and said that he wasn't happy
yeah,
with not having a trade.
yeah,
And the Rockies have just seemed to have really poor management the past couple of years with handling these trade deadlines and their stars, anyways. So
yeah. And it stinks for Story too, because this is a guy that obviously he's playing for nothing this year really when it comes to winning, and he would like to go to a contender, but at the same time also that's going to cost him money because he's going to now have that draft pick attached to him.
yep,
And
absolutely.
whereas if he had gotten traded, then you can't offer him a qualifying offer, and he would not have a draft pick attached to him. He could probably get more money on the open market. So that was one of those things that was pretty, I thought was pretty interesting. That it sucks for Trevor Story 'cause he obviously didn't want to be there, and the fact that they don't, he's now going to have that lose that money. I think he's probably pretty frustrated with that situation.
I would be interested. I know he wouldn't want to really do this, but what if he takes that qualifying offer and plays one more year, forces Colorado to pretty much trade him because they're not going to get anything else for him at that point, and then they don't get a draft pick anyways.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
and $18 million. I mean, in the crowded shortstop
oh
market
yeah.
this year, it might be something where, hey, I don't want to go out into the crowded shortstop market being qualified, and then I can go in next year with no draft pick attached to me. Could be something he
Yeah,
could do.
that's a very interesting thought, and you never know what might happen with it too, because that's entirely possible. I believe it's just the thing that he's a guy that I don't know. I don't know too much about what his market's going to look like because he's played in cores his whole career.
Yeah.
He is a guy who has struggled a little bit this year, but and he's going to have that pick attached to him, so it could very well be a case where he's kind of the guy who doesn't get him, and probably Baez are the two that don't get what they were hoping for on the free agent market. Compared to like Carlos Correa or Corey Seager or someone along those lines. Obviously, Lindor no longer a free agent because he's signing that big deal with the Mets. But I think if you look at I think that's a very interesting thought that he could potentially take that qualifying offer. But you never know. He also might want to go ahead and move on. Team might offer him a lot of long term financial security, which obviously is a big deal too. So, you might get that 18 million next year with the potential to earn more per year, but also someone dangles 150 million dollars in front of your face.
Yeah.
You could also get hurt in that 18 million dollar a year deal and for 1 year deal and never play again. You could be costing yourself 100 million dollars by not taking the big long term deal. So um, it just depends, I think. But that's an interesting thought, and I think you could probably look at the same thing with maybe Baez won't have that qualifying
Nope,
offer, but
not anymore.
you could be looking at the same type of thing where he might sign a 1 year deal type thing. So
Could be. Well, we went on for extremely long on this episode,
yep,
but it was very much warranted. I think this was the most insane trade deadline I've ever seen. And I mean, people have talked about this being the best trade deadline of all time, even. So very, very interesting. There, like I said, we hit on 30 trades, and there were 62 more or 32 more trades that happened that we didn't even hit on. So it was very interesting. I think a lot of big moves. These contenders really stepped up and I think separated themselves. There's a couple teams on the fringe that got those controllable pieces, but we're kind of on the home stretch now. There's no other trades really can happen. There's no waiver deadline anymore in August. So this is teams are pretty much what they are, and we're going to start really seeing who's going to separate themselves in wild card battles and everything. This was the last little step before the run to the playoffs.
Yeah, no doubt. And you look at some of the playoff runs, and the NL East is still really close between the top three teams. It's even tightened up more in the last few days. There's three teams within 3 games right now. You look at the AL East, and you've got the two teams really close together at the top, but the Yankees, with all the moves that they made, are potentially third team to get involved there. You look at the AL wild card race, and you've got a couple teams that are right there. The A's, even the Mariners are not far out of there. Um, and then you look at the NL West race, although all three teams will most likely make the postseason. It's going to be real interesting to see who comes out with the win in that division and who has to play that wild card game because all three teams are close there too. So I think we're going to have a great stretch run this year. Last year wasn't especially with it being such a short season. I don't think was the best pennant race because I think a lot of them were locked up pretty early.
And the
Um,
expanded playoffs even.
and yeah, and even with the expanded playoffs, I mean, maybe it might have also been a little bit of the fact that the last game really, or the last team to get in really didn't matter that much because you knew the Dodgers were going to beat the Brewers or the Cardinals or whoever they were to play. And I mean, I thought most people kind of expected the Braves, although some people picked the Reds. I think most people expected the Braves to win, and then on the other side, I think a lot of people expected on the other side, you had the teams that got in ended up winning, like the Astros. So, uh, you know, coming from nowhere to really contend. So, I thought it was very interesting last year, but this year I think is going to be better, and I think it's going to be a wild run to the finish. Um, so we'll keep an eye on it, and maybe next week we could talk a little bit about what we expect from the next month or two coming into coming into that final stretch.
Yeah, maybe we look back and maybe give some winners and losers of this trade deadline since we've went so long on this episode. We wanted to kind of get that at the end, but we kind of went on talking. But I think very much warranted about some of these trades. So
Oh yeah, no doubt.
we'll bounce back next week, try and get you some of those winners and losers, and kind of maybe look forward to that stretch run and see what we expect. So thank you guys for tuning in to this episode of the Bat Flip Podcast, and we'll catch you guys next week.
Thanks everybody.